There's a law sitting inside the American legal system right now that most people have never heard of. It was not covered in major tech headlines. There was no viral debate about it. No press conference with a recognizable face standing at a podium explaining what it means for the average person. It moved quietly through a state legislature, got signed by a governor, and began ticking down toward a deadline that the open source software community is only now fully grasping the implications of. And if it is allowed to play out the way it was written, over 600 Linux distributions, the backbone of servers, developer machines, privacy-focused computing, scientific research, and enterprise infrastructure worldwide could be legally barred from distributing their software to users in the largest economy in the United States. This is not a hypothetical. The law is real. The deadline is set, and the smallest open source projects are already making exit decisions. This is a story about what happens when lawmakers who understand commercial platforms try to regulate an ecosystem they have never heard of, and what the consequences of that ignorance look like when they land on the people who had nothing to do with the problem being solved. To understand how we got here, you first need to understand the problem this law was genuinely trying to solve. Children's online safety is a serious and legitimate policy issue. Platforms designed for adults have been repeatedly and thoroughly documented exposing minors to content that causes measurable, lasting harm. Eating disorder. Content pushed relentlessly by recommendation algorithms to teenagers searching for fitness advice. Chatbots that encourage suicidal ideation in vulnerable young users. Social media systems optimize D for engagement without any meaningful distinction between an adult scrolling through their feed and a 12-year-old doing the same thing. The political pressure to do something about this has been building for years across both parties, and lawmakers across the United States have been responding with a wave of age verification legislation hitting the internet at multiple layers. Texas passed a law requiring commercial websites hosting adult content to verify the ages of their users. Utah and Louisiana passed App Store Accountability Acts, putting pressure on the platforms that distribute software to minors. The legislative energy around this issue was real, bipartisan, and building momentum with every news cycle that produced another story about a child harmed by an algorithm. California, with over 39 million residents and the fifth largest economy in the entire world, decided to address this problem at a deeper layer than individual apps or individual websites. Rather than targeting specific content categories or specific platforms, California decided to push age verification all the way down to the operating system itself. The thinking, on its surface, has a certain logic to it. If the operating system knows the age of the person using the device, then every app, every website, every platform running on top of that operating system can query that information and make decisions accordingly. You solve the problem once at the foundation instead of thousands of times across thousands of different applications. It is elegant in theory. In practice, it revealed something important about who was and was not in the room when this law was being written. Assembly Bill 1043, formerly known as the California Digital Age Assurance Act, was signed into law by Governor Gavin Newsom on October 13, 2025. The law is Schedule D to take effect on January 1, 2027. Its core requirement reads as straightforward as only legislation written without consulting the affected community can read. Every operating system distributed in California must collect a user's age or date of birth during device setup. That declared age must then be classified into one of four brackets: under 13, 13 to 15, 16 to 17, and 18 and older. The operating system must then expose this bracket as a signal that app stores and application developers can query in real time to verify a user's age before granting access to age-restricted content. The penalty for violation is up to $2,500 per affected child for negligent violations and up to $7,500 per affected child for intentional violations, assessed and collected through civil actions brought by the California Attorney General. On paper, if you only think about iOS and Android, this sounds like a reasonable and implementable consumer protection mechanism. iOS and Android are centrally controlled commercial platforms. Every device running iOS has an Apple account attached to it from the moment of setup. Every device running Android has a Google account. Both companies have legal teams with dozens of attorneys whose entire job is navigating exactly this kind of regulatory requirement. Both companies have compliance infrastructure, revenue streams to fund that infrastructure indefinitely, and centralized control over every piece of software that runs on their platforms. For Apple and Google, implementing age verification at the operating system level is genuinely complex, technically and legally, but it is within the range of things a corporation with hundreds of compliance lawyers and tens of billions in annual revenue can figure out, fund, and maintain. That is the world the drafters of AB 1043 were imagining when they wrote the law. Now consider what an operating system looks like when it is not made by a corporation. Consider Arch Linux. Arch is maintained by a small team of volunteer developers who contribute their personal time around their day jobs. There are no centralized user accounts. There is no identity infrastructure. There is no compliance budget because there is no budget at all in the traditional sense. There is no legal counsel on retainer. Consider Debian, one of the oldest and most widely used Linux distributions in the world, whose roughly 1,000 volunteer developers worldwide operate on an annual budget that would not cover the retainer fee for a single compliance attorney at a mid-sized law firm. Consider Gentoo, where users compile the entire operating system from source code they download themselves, assembling the E-system piece by piece on their own hardware. Consider the hundreds of community distributions that most people have never heard of, but that power real. Machines used by real people every single day. Manjaro, MX Linux, Fedora, Linux Mint, Pop! OS, OpenSUSE, and hundreds more built by volunteers, distributed for free, and designed around an explicit philosophical principle that the operating system does NOT track or identify the person using it. That principle is not a gap in the design. It is the entire point. These projects have no mechanism to collect a user's age. They have no mechanism to store it, verify it, or expose it as a queryable real-time signal to application developers. They have no legal entities in the traditional sense that can be held liable under California civil law. They have no compliance teams, no legal budgets, and no infrastructure for any of what the law demands. And under AB 1043, as originally written, every single one of them is subject to the exact same requirements and the exact same penalties as Apple and Google. The law defines an operating system provider as any entity that distributes software that supports the basic functions of a computing device. That definition does not say commercial entity. It does not say corporation. It does not say for-profit platform. It says any entity. And that definition sweeps up every Linux distribution ever created, all 600 plus of them, alongside the $2 trillion companies the law was clearly designed to target. The penalty math is what makes this existentially dangerous for small projects, rather than merely inconvenient. The fine is not a flat fee. It is per affected child. If a Linux distribution has 10,000 California users, and any portion of them are minors, which is essentially guaranteed for any distribution of meaningful size, a single enforcement action from the California Attorney General representing a category of negligent violations could produce a financial penalty in the tens of millions of dollars. For Canonical, the company behind Ubuntu, which has actual revenue and actual legal infrastructure, that is a serious problem, but a survivable one with the right legal strategy. For the Debian project, which operates on volunteer labor and community donations, a fine at that scale is not a legal challenge. It is an organization-ending event. There is no war chest to draw from. There is no board of directors to authorize emergency fundraising. There is no insurance policy covering regulatory penalties of that magnitude. The project simply ceases to exist. For the hundreds of smaller distributions maintained by individuals or tiny teams of 2 or 3 people contributing nights and weekends, even the legal cost of responding to an enforcement inquiry before any fine is ever assessed, before any judgment is ever entered, would be enough to end the project entirely. The open source community's response to AB 1043 has ranged from outrage to resignation to creative pragmatism, depending on the size of the project and the personality of its maintainers. Midnight BSD, an open-source BSD-derived operating system, made one of the most direct and revealing decisions in early 2026. Its maintainers announced they would modify the project's license to exclude California residents from desktop use entirely. Effective January 1st, 2027, the same day AB 1043 takes effect. The reasoning was blunt and completely honest. A volunteer project with no budget and no legal team cannot afford the legal risk of massive fines. The only rational exit is to block an entire state from using the software. This approach solved the legal problem while creating a different kind of problem that cuts to the philosophical heart of what open source software is supposed to be. The open source definition, the foundational document that defines what open source actually means in a legally and philosophically meaningful sense, explicitly prohibits discrimination against persons or groups of persons. A license that excludes California residents is arguably no longer an open source license by definition. Midnight BSD found itself in a position where AB 1043 made it legally unsafe to comply with the law and simultaneously legally and ethically complicated to avoid it. The law had created a situation where there was no clean path forward. Other projects made different choices that revealed different priorities and different risk tolerances. Parrot OS, a security-focused distribution widely used by cybersecurity professionals and privacy researchers, signaled that it would attempt surface-level compliance while building in mechanisms that allowed technically sophisticated users to bypass verification in practice, satisfying the letter of the law in a way designed to make the verification essentially meaningless while preserving the privacy principles the project was built on. Debian began extended internal debates about the full implications, which is very much in keeping with Debian's culture of deliberate consensus building. Alma Linux, a community-driven enterprise Linux distribution, called the law a mess and chose to monitor court proceedings and decisions from upstream projects before committing to any changes in its own software. Ubuntu developers at Canonical floated a technical proposal using dbus, a Linux interprocess communication system, as a potential mechanism to surface age data to app stores. This was an early-stage idea with no shipped implementation, and it immediately raised the questions that no one had good answers to. Where does the age data originate? Who collects it? Who stores it? Who is legally responsible for its accuracy and its security? No unified technical solution emerged from the Linux community because the problem AB 1043 creates is not fundamentally a technical problem. It is an architectural one. Open source distributions are not designed to know who is using them. That is not an oversight. It is a deliberate design choice made for very good reasons that this law entirely failed to account for. The open source community's failure to engage during the legislative process made all of this significantly worse than it needed to be. When AB 1043 was moving through the California legislature, the major open source organizations, the Open Source Initiative, the Free Software Foundation, the Software Freedom Conservancy, and the Linux Foundation provided no formal testimony and made no public interventions during the process. The Electronic Frontier Foundation engaged with broader age verification and surveillance concerns, but did not specifically address the structural impossibility of applying OS-level age verification requirements to volunteer-run open-source distributions. The organizations most directly affected by the law were completely absent from the process that created it. The people who had both the standing and the technical expertise to explain why this requirement is architecturally impossible for community-built software were simply not in the room, and the result was a law designed entirely around the commercial operating system model, without any awareness that a parallel ecosystem of non-commercial operating systems had existed for decades and powered a significant portion of the world's computing infrastructure. The federal dimension of this story makes the California situation even more significant in the long run. On April 13, 2026, a bipartisan bill called the Parents Decide Act was introduced in the United States House of Representatives as H.R. 8250. The bill was sponsored by Representative Josh Gottheimer, a Democrat from New Jersey, and Representative Elise Stefanik, a Republican from New York. The Parents Decide Act applies the same core idea as California's AB 1043, but at the national level. It would require every operating system provider in the United States to collect a date of birth from every user before allowing them to complete setup or use the device. For users under 18, it would require parental or guardian verification. It would require operating system providers to build and maintain an interface allowing app developers to query age verification data on demand. Enforcement would fall to the Federal Trade Commission, which would be required to issue implementing regulations within 180 days of enactment. The bill is currently in the early stages of the legislative process, referred to the House Committee on Energy and Commerce. No hearing has been scheduled and no additional co-sponsors have joined as of the time of this script. But it exists. It is bipartisan. And it is moving through a Congress that has made children's online safety one of its more consistent areas of genuine cross-party agreement. If H.R. 8250 passes without an open source exemption, the California problem, which currently affects one state, becomes an American problem overnight, and there is no amendment bill waiting in the wings at the federal level to fix it. The broader regulatory context matters here. Texas's age verification law for adult websites was upheld by the Supreme Court in June 2025. Establishing that some forms of mandatory age verification are constitutionally permissible when the government interest in protecting minors is considered sufficient. That ruling gave legal confidence to state legislators across the country who had been uncertain whether their age verification bills would survive constitutional challenges. Since the Supreme Court's ruling, more states have accelerated their own versions of age verification legislation. Colorado followed California with its own law, Senate Bill 26-521, which similarly failed to account for open source software in its original language. The wave is not receding, it is building, state by state, with template language circulating among legislative staffers and the political momentum of bipartisan child safety branding, making these bills difficult to oppose publicly even when the technical objections are sound. Now here's where the story takes its most significant recent turn. The pressure from the open source community, the coverage in publications like Tom's Hardware and TechRadar, and the sustained attention from privacy advocates finally produced a legislative response. Assemblymember Buffy Wicks, the same lawmaker who originally authored AB 1043, introduced an amendment bill called Assembly Bill 1856 in February 2026. The amendment includes language that would explicitly exempt open source software from the age verification requirement. The exemption in its latest revised form, dated May 18, 2026, excludes any entity that distributes software under licenses that allow users to copy, redistribute, or edit it. That definition covers Linux distributions and essentially all open source operating systems by design. If AB 1856 passes with this language intact, Linux distributions would be legally off the hook in California. The same exemption mechanism was applied to Colorado's law earlier in the spring. AB 1856 cleared the California Assembly on May 28, 2026 by a vote of 68-1, which is about as overwhelming a legislative majority as UCAN achieve in American state politics. But it has not yet passed the Senate, and the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which opposed AB 1043 from the beginning, has raised concerns about additional provisions in the amendment bill, particularly a clause that extends age gating requirements to browsers and websites, which the EFF argues represents a net expansion of the surveillance regime, even if Linux gets a carve-out. The amendment is not a clean victory. It is a partial correction to a law that was flawed from the start, accompanied by new provisions that extend the flawed framework into different parts of the internet. Let me make the compliance problem concrete, because the abstract statement that it is impossible for small projects deserves to be grounded in something real. Imagine you are the maintainer of a mid-sized Linux distribution with around 50,000 downloads per month. You have no idea how many of those downloads originate from California, because tracking user locations would be directly antithetical to the privacy-first philosophy your project was built around. Under AB 1043, without an exemption, you would need to implement an age collection mechanism during the operating system setup process, classify the declared age into 4 regulatory brackets, store that classification persistently across sessions, and expose it through a queryable real-time interface that application developers can access whenever they need to verify a user's age. Building that infrastructure requires dedicated software development capacity, server infrastructure to store and serve the data, legal frameworks governing how the data is collected and protected, a compliant privacy policy reviewed by an attorney, and ongoing maintenance for as long as the law remains in effect. None of those things exist in your project. Your team is 3 people who contribute evenings and weekends. Your annual budget is community donations and discounted hosting. The development cost of even a minimal compliance system would exceed your entire annual budget. The leg. All cost of a single attorney review to assess whether your implementation meets the Attorney General's regulatory standards would exceed it again, and you would need to maintain this indefinitely, revisiting and updating your compliance approach every time the Attorney General's regulations evolved, which they will. The alternative AB 1043 implicitly offers is not better. You could block California users from downloading your distribution, but to do that, you would need to know which users are in California, which means you would need to geolocate IP addresses at download time, which means you would need to collect and process user location data. That is precisely what your project was philosophically designed not to do. And even if you implemented IP geolocation blocking, California residents using VPNs would still download your software with no technical obstacle, creating a legally ambiguous situation where you made a good faith compliance effort that you cannot verify was effective. The good faith provision in the law provides some protection, but it does not eliminate risk for a project that has no legal counsel to advise on whether its specific efforts constitute good faith in the Attorney General's interpretation. The surveillance infrastructure concern at the center of this entire debate also deserves direct attention, because it is not a secondary issue. Age verification systems are identity databases. When a commercial operating system collects a date of birth at device setup, that information is stored attached to an account and subject to the data security practices of the company that collected IT. A data breach at a major social media platform in 2025 exposed 70,000 verified IDs submitted for age verification purposes, documents that users had submitted to access a platform, collected centrally and exposed when that database was compromised. Building mandatory age verification into every operating system at the national level creates the largest identity collection mandate in the history of consumer technology, with a breach exposure profile that scales accordingly. And privacy advocates have noted an uncomfortable irony embedded in the regulatory architecture being built around children's safety. The companies best positioned to comply with LE, Google, and Microsoft, which also happen to be the companies with the most sophisticated advertising and user profiling infrastructure in existence, Mandatory age verification does not just enable parental controls. It creates a verified identity signal flowing through the operating system into every application that queries it, enriching the data profiles that power targeted advertising with verified demographic information that previously had to be inferred. The Regulate ORI architecture being built around children's safety looks from a certain angle, less like protection and more like a competitive moat that locks in the largest incumbents while making life impossible for everyone else. The story of California's AB 1043 is ultimately about something larger than one state law and one ecosystem of software. It is about what happens at the intersection of legitimate policy goals and technical ignorance at the legislative level. The open source ecosystem EM that powers the majority of the world's servers, the majority of developer tools, the majority of scientific and academic computing infrastructure, and the personal machines of hundreds of millions of privacy-conscious users was built by volunteers operating under a philosophical commitment to software freedom that is fundamentally incompatible with surveillance-based compliance regimes. When a law is written that treats the Debian project the SAM-E as Apple Inc., it is not a law that was written carelessly by people who did not care about the consequences. It is a law that was written in genuine ignorance of the thing it was regulating. And the cost of that ignorance is not borne by Apple, which has the resources and infrastructure to navigate any compliance requirement a state legislature can devise. It is borne by the thousands of volunteer developers who build tools the hundreds of millions of people rely on every single day, and who have neither the resources nor the legal infrastructure to defend themselves when a regulator comes knocking. The exemption amendment may pass. California's Linux community may get its carve-out before the January 1st, 2027 deadline. The vote of 68-1 in the Assembly suggests that when legislators actually arse software, they are not interested in that outcome. But the Federal Parents Decide Act has no such exemption. It is already in committee. It is bipartisan. And the political momentum behind children's online safety legislation at the federal level is arguably stronger right now than it has ever been. The battle for open source software in American law is not over. It has barely started. And the open source community's near total absence from the legislative process that created this situation is a lesson that needs to be learned before the next deadline appears on the calendar without warning.